This is the second lecture for Monday, April 13th. This will be a relatively short lecture since the first one was so long. So we're turning our attention now to flow of energy through communities. We looked at how energy enters into an organism, how it's channeled to these different components of an energy budget for an individual organism. So that's what's going on in individual organisms. Now, a plant channels energy through its body. A little frog channels energy through its body, but that energy moves from one organism to the next. That plant is eaten by a deer. That deer is eaten by a wolf. That frog is eating insects that are feeding on little smaller insects that are feeding on zooplankton, that's feeding on phytoplankton. So we're going to look at the flow of energy from one organism to another. And we're going to start with this simplistic way of just basically following energy from one organism to another. And then we realize that one organism doesn't just eat one thing for the most part, and it's not just eaten by one thing, but most organisms prey on a number of different things, or if they're not predators, they feed on a number of different things. And they're eaten by a number of different things. So this idea of food chain, it's fine for looking at flow from one organism to another, this one step after another, one level. However, they're all intertwined, and it's what's a lot more accurate is a web of interactions, a web of energy flow rather than a chain. First of all, let's look at some of the participants in this food chain. These are certainly, some of you have heard of these terms before, and we've talked about some of these, but basically you've got producers. You have photosynthetic organisms. So for the most part, on land, they're plants. In the ocean, there's a lot of phytoplankton. There's algae. There's also some blue-green algae that are primary producers, photosynthetic organisms. So that's how you get energy into living things to begin with. Is sunlight is converted to chemical energy. Sunlight is converted to organic forms of energy. So that's the first step. Producers. They produce some form of energy that's available to everybody else. Then you've got primary consumers, herbivores, like a deer or a mouse, something that's eating plants. Could be the leaves. We looked at a whole bunch of different aspects of herbivory. You can eat bark, you can eat fruit, you can eat seeds. One way or the other, though, you're feeding on a producer. So there's primary consumers. Most of these are small, but there's some herbivores, some primary consumers that are huge, big giant things. Then you've got secondary consumers, carnivores. They're not feeding on plants, but they're feeding on something else. They're feeding on herbivores for the most part. Some of them are feeding on other carnivores. But that's three levels. This energy started out in plants. Those plants were eaten by primary consumers. So the energy was transferred from the plant to a primary consumer. Now this primary consumer is fed on by the secondary consumer. So there's another level that this energy has been transferred to. And then these carnivores are fed on by higher carnivores. Sometimes there's another level where other carnivores eat the carnivores that fed on other carnivores that fed on the herbivores that fed on the plants. So there's tertiary consumers, these food chains. And these, you can look at the flow of energy from one organism to the next and look at these food chains. But really, as I said, what's more realistic is a web, because you've got things that are feeding on multiple sources of food, and you've got things that are being eaten by multiple organisms. So if you're just tracing energy flow from one organism to the next, though, you could look at this as a chain. So here's an example of a chain. You've got energy from the sun, photons, light energy, that's converted not by plants but by dinoflagellates, which are phytoplankton. photosynthetic organism. Now you've got energy in the form of sugar in these dinoflagellates. These tiny little microscopic dinoflagellates are fed upon by copepods, which are zooplankton, also little tiny microscopic. Those are the primary producers. And then those are fed upon by something like the ocean sunfish. Now that's a pretty big fish. But there's a lot of fish that eat copepods. There's filter feeders that eat copepods. There's small fish that eat copepods. There's even squid that eat copepods. But now you've got energy that originally was in the sun, then it went to this primary producer, then it went to a primary consumer, the copepods, and now it's in some relatively small fish. That fish is eaten by some little shark or some bigger fish. So you've got energy from the sun to the producer, that's one step. To the primary consumer, that's 2 steps. To the secondary consumer, that's 3 steps. And now to this little shark, that's 4 steps. And that little shark, or little fish, is eaten by a big shark. Or it could be a killer whale, or it could be a sperm whale, or some big predator. It could be a marine mammal, or a bird that's eating these smaller fish. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 transfers of energy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arrows that have gone between 6 different types of energy. Now that is a chain of energy that shows these different levels of feeding, or different trophic levels. Each trophic level represents a different level by which energy has been transformed from one organism to the next, or one level to the next. And as I said, what's really more accurate is not a food chain like this, but a food web. So if you look at food webs, we're not going to go into that much detail about this before we start looking at trophic levels. But this is more realistic, whether you're talking about the ocean, or these are all terrestrial examples. But you see there's some grass in all of these. There's some decomposers that transfer energy to plants. In all of these examples, though, there's some kind of primary producer. There's plants. There's grass, whether they're labeled or not. You can see this primary producer, some photosynthetic organism. And then you've got an herbivore, the arrow that's directly connected to this plant. So you've got a deer, you've got a rabbit, you've got a grasshopper. In some of these, there's another rabbit, you've got a cow, you've got a bird that eats seeds, you've got squirrels, you've got insects that eat plants. And each one of these, if you pick any one of those food webs and look at it, then you'll see that this plant is fed upon by some herbivore. And then this little rabbit, or this little mouse, or the little bird, is fed upon by some higher level consumer, some secondary consumer, like a bird or a fox or an owl or a snake or something like that. And then they're usually eaten by something else. So for instance, if you look at a snake that eats a lizard that eats some kind of plant, or eats an insect that's feeding on a plant, and then you have a hawk that eats the snake, then this hawk is eating a snake that eats a lizard that eats an insect that eats a plant. That's the chain that we looked at. But that snake is also eating mice in addition to the lizard or salamander. That snake could be eating insects. That hawk is not just eating the snake, it's eating a mouse, it's eating these birds, it's eating a number of different things. So all these things are interwoven. They're all interconnected by where they get their energy and where their energy ends up going to another organism, or whether they're dying and going back into the system through decomposers. Now this one, the colored picture in the right, shows those brown arrows of everything dies. Everything is going to end up as contributing to the decomposers. But this is a way of looking at this in terms of the interconnectedness of everything, in terms of a web, not just a chain. There are food chains that illustrate these different trophic levels, but really everything's interconnected. That's what ecology is all about. So the next thing that we can talk about are different trophic levels. That's what we'll start on Wednesday.